For most kids in Morton, especially in my parents' generation, the simple act of walking down the path known locally as the Chicken Run was a terrifying prospect. The narrow alleyway runs between people's allotments and gets its name predictably from the fact that somewhere near the top of the hill, one of the allotment keepers used to have chickens. A few still do, though which of them would now claim to have given the stretch of path its name is anyone's guess. Toward the bottom of the hill, the allotments peter out and you find yourself skirting the edges of farmland. One of which in particular is of note because it is where Ragbag, the infamous scarecrow, still stands to watch over the fields and loom large in the imaginations of Morton's terrified children. Still, whilst it was always Ragbag that haunted the shadows and imaginations of that generation, when I was at school, there was another secondary story that made the journey down that run terrifying. It involved a small plot much further up the hill than the field where Ragbag waited. A plot that contained the greenhouse owned by Adrian Leach. At the slumber parties I attended as a child in the damp cloakrooms of my high school lunch breaks, and particularly on the graffiti-tagged benches at a local park where my friends and I would swig cheap cider and any form of spirit stolen from our parents' cupboards, Leach's greenhouse was the real chiller. I remember many nights perched on those old park benches, swigging from an oversized bottle of White Lightning. We'd exchange stories of what we'd heard went on in that little glass building. The stories varied wildly, but the basic idea was always the same. Adrian Leach, as everybody knew, worked in the city at the big hospital. Not as a doctor or even as a nurse, but as a porter working primarily in the morgue. It was his job, as he was keen on telling people, to incinerate the parts that needed to be discarded after operations. To dispose of tissue and hazardous materials, and particularly and intriguingly, body parts. Naturally, such a strange occupation was already fertile ground for rumours in a place like Morton, and there were already stories of Adrian coming home from the city on the train with huge sacks that bulged at the seams. Some folks went so far as to say that they had seen him carrying sheets tied up at the ends and stained with large red-brown marks, in which he seemed to be carrying objects that pressed and tumbled against the fabric at strange and pointed angles. But what does that have to do with the greenhouse, you might ask? Well, the answer is simple. Some initially said that Adrian was bringing remains and body parts home to feed to his dogs, Jupiter and Butch. Others that he used the body parts to fertilize the plants he had growing in that greenhouse, plants so tall and so dense that despite the thing having mucky glass walls, you could not see inside for the wall of vegetation lining the edges. Even those stories, however, evolved into something more complex. Eventually, the story became that Adrian was engaged in his own experiments. He had read about the idea of farmers grafting arms from one fruit tree onto another, tying up a branch from a lemon tree and attaching it to an orange tree so that it eventually merged with the trunk and the one tree would give two different types of fruit. Having run with this idea, he decided to try it with human tissue. To that end, he took tendons, nerves, and networks of arteries and planted them in pots, winding them up with ivy and vines. He allowed the stems of flowers to grow through the marrow of discarded bones, and even tried to knit skin tissue and organs to the roots of plants in an attempt to grow new ones. Here the stories began to vary. In some versions, this led to flowers that instead of having stamens in the center of their petals, had red and raw human eyeballs attached to their meaty stems. Others said that he had grown Venus flytraps that instead of sporting needle points on their edges, showed the spongy pink of human gums, from which sharp and rudimentary teeth jutted at irregular angles. There were tales of tiny weeping willow trees that stooped and bent under the weight of human hair growing in sheets from its branches. Then, of course, there was the story about the branches, or more specifically, the limbs. Perhaps the creepiest story attached to that tiny building was the one about the so-called Tree of Limbs. It was alleged that somewhere toward the back of that building there was a tree planted directly into the earth that had grown to a height of almost 7 feet so that it pressed and curved against the roof of the structure. This tree, according to local legend, had the usual trunk of wood and bark, but as it rose toward the top, spread out across the width of the roof with arms and hands like those of a human. Some, they said, were heavy hands, perfectly formed and the size of a large man's, but hanging limply from a thin and inadequate arm that more closely resembled the drooping stem of a flower or the tube of an intestine, pink, slender, and unable to hold the weight of the paw attached to its end. Other limbs were strong, but the hands themselves were malformed, the fingers far too long to be recognizably human, whilst other limbs became arms that reached out with multiple hands attached, all of them grasping, reaching, and clawing at the air. I had seen drawings made by people who claimed to have seen this tree. In them, the central trunk, whilst having the textures and appearance of wood, is also in places bloated and pink. In some drawings, there was swelling like a pregnant belly, even a belly button, fringed with hair, and above it, arms and hands, fanning out in a hideous spread like the limbs of an ordinary tree, and yet strangely tortured. The fingers always fumbling and moving, opening and closing in tiny pinching, grabbing gestures as this eyeless thing tried to feel the world around it. The drawings, as you might imagine, were hideous. The stories, as we told or repeated them on those half-drunk adolescent nights, were gruesome and over the top. But they were also enough to make us sprint past that small glass house. To catch our breath in the middle, then make a second desperate run, past the creepy old scarecrow waiting for us at the bottom. Back then, for my generation, they were just words and myths. Today's generation has it worse, because now the myths are flavoured with truth. Adrian Leach was eventually sacked from his job and prosecuted for removing the materials he was supposed to have disposed of. When people in Morton heard this news, they assumed it was a joke, confirmation of an urban legend, but there was no joke. Adrian had been bringing tissues with him from work, and by his own admission he had taken them to his greenhouse. What the police might have found in that small construction if they'd searched it, we'll never know. Days before such a search might have been made, vigilantes, most likely kids but perhaps adults as well, went up to the chicken run and smashed in every pane of glass in that greenhouse. I'm sure when they left, they assumed that justice had been served and that they were expressing their disgust at Adrian's actions. What they did not anticipate was that by morning, whilst the shattered glass and metal frames remained in place, every plant that had been there had vanished. Adrian, who had been in police custody at the time, could not have been responsible, and when he was informed of what had happened is said to have burst into tears, repeating over and over,
"They'll be out now, escaped. You've let them out, you've let them all out."
A week later, Father Dominic Lee, a priest visiting Morton from another parish, gave a statement to the police, warning them of a thing he had seen by the edge of Acres Wood. Despite having no knowledge of the local children's folklore, Father Dominic, hardly prone to fantasy or a man likely to lie just for the sake of it, swore with his hand on a Bible that he had seen a thing that looked like a tree, but with human hands and arms for branches. According to Father Dominic, the thing had lurched and lumbered in some awkward motion like walking toward the other trees. When officers asked exactly how a so-called tree could move in the first place, Father Dominic is said to have looked as if he would cry himself. By way of explanation, he suggested the officers imagine a great spider or octopus, which instead of having the usual thin and jointed legs, had a dozen arms all outstretched.
"Now imagine,"
he said,
"the thing crawling, skittering and creeping at speed as some great spider would toward the tree line, its heavy central trunk, pink and flabby, whilst its top half continues to claw at the air, at the sky, at anything it might touch with score upon score of wanting, needing hands. I dread to think what it might have done had it grasped hold of any living thing. Things that claw like that, they do so because they're hungry. It was,
the priest is said to have proclaimed,
a vision from hell."
Though of course the residents of this town know better. That thing, if indeed it does exist, is not a thing that crawled from hell. That thing was born in Morton,